Hello and welcome to this second video of the Diachromie overview series. I'm Paul, I'm a cinematographer and I'm one of the creators behind Diachromie. And we're going to look at the contrast and color tone curves module in this video. As we recommend, you can see I've color managed my project in an ACES CCT environment. All my clips are color managed correctly. So we call contrast and color tone curves 1D transformations. And that's because all the transformations can, in the end, be encompassed in a 1D LUT. Each channel, red, green, and blue, will be affected by one curve. Even if we can make these curves pretty complex, and we do in our modules, we're still limited by that. 3D transformations, on the other hand, handle the color as a 3D cube. That means we're able to work with more complex operators and transformations, and also that we are able to target more localized areas of the color for specific behaviors. We will address 3D transformations in the following video. We usually start with contrast and color tone curves when we craft a look, and that's because they have a big structural impact on the image, and they get refined later on with the 3D transformations. This is reflected by the orders in which the operations appear in the interface. It's important to note that the order in which the operations appear is not the order in which they're applied mathematically. 1D transformations will usually happen at the end of the stack because they apply major compressions to the image, and you want to get that later on and get more information before when you do all the 3D. The exact order of processing can be found on our website. I'm going to display a tool that is pretty useful when doing contrast. That's the curves. This allows me to monitor the contrast curve that I'm going to shape with the contrast module. We can start by adding some contrast to the curve. This first slider will define the general slope of the curve here. And then we can set up the offset of the highlights and shape the shoulder roll-off. So that's these two settings right here. These two settings used together let you control the shape of the top part of the curve. And you have, of course, similar sliders for the lower part of the curve here. That is the black offset and the toe roll-off. So as you can see in a couple of operations, I get to shape a relatively complex curve. It's complex, but it's continuous. It's a single mathematical function, and you get access to its parameters in the interface. If you want to increase the complexity of the curve, you get access to a couple of other settings. The mid-push slider here lets you give a little more room around the neutral gray. And as you can see when I do that, you get a bit more information, kind of a bump around here near the neutral gray. So when you enable the mid-push, of course you get that extra information here, but more importantly, you also get movements on the top and the bottom parts. And that's because by default, we compensate the mid-push to keep the exposure consistent. We believe a look should not change the way you expose your image. And that should happen, for instance, by using the camera metadata with the exposure index, if it's an option. But if you don't share this belief, or if you have a specific need, you can disable the mid-push compensate right here. That actually lets us see better the way the mid-push operates. It gives more leeway here around the neutral gray. The Luma blend operator lets you progressively inject the contrast only on the Luma and not on the color. By default, we apply the contrast to RG and B, and that increases saturation. If you want to limit that behavior, you can increase the Luma blend, and you'll get contrast progressively on the Luma only, up to 1, where there's no contrast applied on RGB, but only on the Luma. The blend operator blends all the contrast curves at once. It actually goes over 1, which is pretty useful when you're satisfied with the overall shape of the curve, but you want to get a little bit more strong or get some contrast, a bit more contrast in the look. And finally, under the exposure subsection, we get access to 2 extra sliders. Flare, that is a linear offset of the curve, so it allows you to lift up the blacks or crush the lowlights a little bit more in the other direction. And exposure is a linear tool that changes the exposure of the whole image. If you go to 1, you get the equivalent of a one-stop offset. As for every module in the plugin, you get access to a preset loading feature here. And if you choose a preset in this list, you'll only load the contrast part of this preset. If you want to have your own preset here accessible, just export the preset here. You'll get all your look in the file, and then you can load your contrast curve from here whenever you want. Once you're satisfied with your contrast, you can move down to the color tone curves. You might come back to it later on. That's one of the perks of the parametric approach. You can always come back to your first module and edit it if your color tone curves or maybe your 3D transformations makes you think you need to edit your contrast. But globally, it's a good rule of thumb to start contrast, then color tone curves, and then go all the way down to 3D transformations. The color tone curves lets you inject color in the highlights, the midtones, or the shadows of your image. For that module, the curves is still very useful, and we can also enable the color tone targets. With the color tone targets from left to right, you get to visualize which hue you will be injecting in the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. The three sections, highlights, midtones, and shadows, have the same overall design. So let's focus on the shadows here. First, you can select the hue target. That's the color you will inject in the shadows. As you can see, when I slide it, the target here will change, but for now, nothing happens on the image. And that's because my saturation slider is at 0. And this defines the intensity of the effect. So we need to increase the saturation to start injecting the color in the shadows. As you can see here, something is happening in the shadows, and you can visualize it on the curve. You can control the spread of the effect with two operators. The neutral zone extent helps you protect the area around the neutral gray. On the other side of the shadows, you can control the spill in the blacks with the low offset operator. On one side, you get to spill more on the lowlights, and on the other side, you get to protect the lowlights. You can make the effect operate in a subtractive way. That means that the more the shadows get tinted, the darker they get. This is here the subtractive saturation blend. And this is not a one or nothing operator. You get a continuous blend setting from this subtractive behavior. You get access to the same set of operators for the midtones and the highlights. The offset operators in the highlights are very useful when doing HDR grading. When you use a basic tinting operator, it ends up being too strong in the specular lights because they're very, very high in the luminance spectrum when doing HDR. The roll-off offset allows you to accommodate for that. I can monitor the extended curve and I get to see my behavior here on the highlights. With the extended curve display, I get to see the values above 1, that's useful in HDR. And so here I can see that my tinting on the highlights gets all the way up there, and that can be anyway a problem in HDR. And the roll-off offset will be very useful for that because I can keep my effects in the highlights, but neutralize it in the specular. So as you can see, with a bit of work on the contrast and on the color tone curves, I can already shape the look and feel of my image. And this is something that will work in a very robust way on my images. I can get a variety of situations, diversity of light, color, texture situations, and this has an interesting effect. Maybe it's not exactly what you want for some of the images, but this has a robust, coherent, interesting, and visually pleasing effect. And finally, of course, you get access to the preset list here and your own preset library once you've built it. There's a couple of other tools that we haven't covered, and you should check them out yourself if you wish. There's a global tint submodule that works in the same way, but for the whole picture. So that's a good place to, for instance, introduce a color cast. There's also a way to filter the whole module by saturation. It's called the saturation mask. So you can look around and you'll see that there are ways to make it even more complex if that's what you want to do with the color tone curves. So this wraps up the contrast and color tone curves overview of Diachromie. In the next video, we'll look into the 3D transformations. Thanks for watching.